Hello, everyone. Welcome to another episode of Dollar Dialogue. Today's episode is episode 56, Autarky versus Openness. And today we'll be looking at a cost benefit analysis of trade policy. So, welcome back to another episode this week where we break down the biggest economic debates shaping our world today. I'm your host, Arif, and in this episode, we are tackling a question that has sort of haunted policymakers for centuries. Should a nation wall itself off from the world? China has historically done that, and they have been successful just letting it just like pointing that out, or through open its doors to trade. China recently did that since like the 1980s, and they're probably one of the, if not, I believe the second most economically successful country in terms of GDP. So, in other words, autarky versus openness when it comes to trade. Trade is often the bloodstream of the global economy, but what happens when a country decides to close its veins, cut itself off, and try to survive entirely alone? At first, autarky seems empowering, like full sufficiency, independence from foreign policy, and insulation from sanctions. No power, no outside power could hold your country hostage. But here's the catch: by not comparative advantage, due to comparative advantage, autarky forces nations to produce inefficiently, pay more, and innovate less. Therefore, this is a contentious topic, and understanding these nuances are incredibly important for us, especially for IBDP students worldwide, as well as for other teenagers who are part of the AP or other curriculums to learn more about the nuances. Today, for our guest speaker, we have Mr. Hamdan Karim. Mr. Hamdan Karim is probably after quite deliberation, we landed on Mr. Hamdan Karim. Mr. Hamdan Karim is probably one of the smartest intellectuals when it comes to economics, particularly behavioral economics as well as managerial economics. Hamdan has a lot of expertise in this field. He is currently working on a research paper in economics as well, and the research is particularly on behavioral economics and how it intersects with growth in Bangladesh. So we are very proud to have Hamdan today. So, Mr. Hamdan Karim, is there anything else you would like to add to the introduction that I've just said?
Thank you very much. This is my second chance of this amazing podcast, and I'm very happy to be here. I want to say my this podcast made my passion of finance to the next level. So I want to say you guys are an inspiration to the next youth, like not just to me, like other young people that are interested in finance. This is what they look up to. They look up to you guys. I think it's amazing what you do for them.
Thank you, Mr. Hamdan Karim, for those very kind and passionate words. I wholeheartedly would like to extend my sincereness to that. So, moving on, autarky versus openness. This is, as I've mentioned before, we'll do a cost benefit analysis in this video. So, as I was saying before, autarky is countries like DPRK. Even DPRK, North Korea itself, is not a full autarky because they still trade with Russia. But DPRK is probably the most extreme case that we see in modern economics today, and they are autarky. They try to be fully self-sufficient and independent from foreign influence, but clearly it's not working out for them. And on the other side of the debate lies openness, and this is where countries integrate into global economy. Here, countries specialize in what they do best, import what others can produce more cheaply, and ride the wave of economies of scale, technology spillovers, and competitive pressure. This model has powered growth stories from China to Singapore, yet openness carries its own fragility. Global financial crashes, pandemics, and trade wars now show how quickly interdependence can turn into vulnerability. For example, Germany, before the Ukraine-Russia war, were doing incredibly well as an economy. They were open to other European nations. They still are the largest country with GDP in Europe. However, due to their independence on oil and natural gas from Russia, due to the sanctions imposed on Russia, people basically died from like cold in winter in Germany in like 2022 and 2023. And that's like an extreme cases of what happens when you're too interdependent on other countries. So where does the balance lie? That's the heart of today's debate. And across this episode, we'll weigh the sovereignty against prosperity, resilience against efficiency, and more importantly, theory against real world history. So with that being said, is there anything else that you would like to add to the information that I've just said, Mr. Suprit Nagala, Mr. Shazib Karim, or Mr. Hamdan Karim? Mr. Suprit Nagala, I see that your hand is raised. Would you like to chime in?
Yes, sir. Yes, Mr. Malik. So I heard you talking about China and how China was. I don't know what you said exactly about how China was doing autarky, but you also talked about how China started flourishing with openness. So there are a few specific examples that illustrate China very well. But before we can go to this, I think we should rewind a few decades. In the 1950s and 60s, China was deeply autarkic, and after the revolution in 1949, the country wanted to be economically self reliant, cut off from Western influence, industrialize on its own, and depend as little as possible on international trade. On paper, it actually sounded like strength through independence. No foreign interference, no external shocks, no dependency. But in reality, it significantly limited growth. During the Mao era, China's focus on domestic production and central planning created inefficiencies. Comparative advantages better explain these inefficiencies. And industries started lacking innovation, technology was outdated, and productivity stayed low. The country's share of global trade was tiny, and living standards lagged behind. And the GDP per capita was low, very low, until the turning point came in 1978. Under Deng Xiaoping, China began to open up. The phrase reform and opening up wasn't just a slogan, it was a revolution in policy. China began inviting foreign investment, establishing special economic zones like Shenzhen, and promoting exports. The results? Absolutely staggering. In just a few days, China had transformed from one of the world's poorest nations while under autarkic rule into the world's second largest economy by GDP and the actual number one largest economy by PPP. So hundreds of millions were lifted out of poverty, and global trade turned China into the factory of the world. And the benefits rippled across every sector: manufacturing, technology, finance, you name it. But of course, openness came with new vulnerabilities. This created a dependency on global demand, exposure to trade wars like the current tariff war with Donald Trump, and growing inequality between coastal and inland regions. But overall, the economic payoff was enormous and outweighed the negatives. So, at least in China's case, when someone asks which one was better, autarky or openness, my answer personally, at least in China's case, is clear. Autarky gives stability, but stagnation. Openness brings volatility, but growth. And that's the trade off every country faces. Economic openness invites risk, but it also invites opportunity. The question isn't whether to open up, but how much and how strategically. And that's what makes the debate around autarky versus openness so fascinating. It's not black and white, it's about balance, timing, and adaptability. So, Hamdan, our beloved guest speaker, or Arib, and even Shazib Karim, do you guys have anything to say about China under autarkic uh, versus open rule?
Mr. Shazib Karim, I see that your hand is raised. Would you like to chime in?
Mr. Karim, I'm unable to hear you for some reason. Mr. Hamdan, would you by any chance would like to chime in?
Oh yeah, yes, of course. Thank you, Supit, for giving me the chance to speak. So yeah, as you said, trade has always been the bloodstream of the global economy. But what happens when a country, yeah, so what happens when a country like China decides to do that? Openness, on the other hand, has been celebrated as the engine of modern growth. By integrating into the world economy, countries can specialize according to comparative advantage, import cheaper goods, and export what they produce most efficiently. Openness unlocks economies of scale, technology transfers, and knowledge spillovers that no country can replicate in isolation. It expands consumer and producer surplus, widens the welfare triangle and in dynamic terms, accelerates long run growth. Uh, yeah, so the rise of Singapore as a global hub, China's transformation after 1978 reforms, and the UAE's pivot from oil dependence to diversified service sectors are all evidence of the openness openness it is. So yeah, I'm very impressed by it. Uh, so would anyone like to chime in?
Mr. Hamdan Karim, I would wholeheartedly agree with your stance. And now, now, since Dollar Dialogue always tries to see both sides of the issue, I think it's better if we play the devil's advocate. Because in recent times, even in Bangladesh or anywhere else in the world, if we ask someone which one they would choose, all of them would choose openness. But that isn't the purpose of Dollar Dialogue's debate. We want to see the other side as well. Now, just to play the devil's advocate, I want to advocate for autarky. Not that I believe in it, but just to see where it lies. And autarky on the surface sounds like an economic straitjacket: higher costs, less efficiency, fewer choices. But let's pause and play the devil's advocate, as I've been mentioning here. Isn't there also something powerful about self sufficiency? For countries, in my opinion, that have endured colonial exploitation, reliance on foreign imports can feel like dependency dressed up as efficiency. Take the India after independence in 1947. In history class during Mr. Spivey in 10th grade, I remember the license Raj. And here, this license Raj and import substitution policies were designed by the British to protect sovereignty after centuries of British extraction. Or look at the Soviet Union during the Cold War. Autarkic policies allowed it to industrialize rapidly and survive sanctions, although it came with inefficiencies. Even today, North Korea, for all its struggles, demonstrates how autarky can shield the regime from total collapse despite decades of international isolation. And let's combine a little bit of history as well. I remember specifically that during World War II, Britain's survival depended on producing its own food and weapons under blockade. Because think about it, Nazi Germany was controlling all or pretty much entirety of Europe, and if it wasn't for Winston Churchill's great leadership, Britain would probably have succumbed to the Nazi Germany as well. But how did Britain survive? And other than leadership and military might, I would say it is partly because of autarky as well. Because Winston Churchill, he was, some might say he's a socialist, but in my opinion, he created the idea of sufficiency in UK, where UK started producing its own food. And they also, and keep in mind, during World War II, Britain couldn't import many of its food and supplies from India, or Africa, or other parts of its empire, because pretty much there was a blockade, and like there were Nazi submarines, machinery which would like intersect those supplies. So Britain had to like produce its own food, and they were successful. Now, also looking at modern day, let's look at Iran. Sanctions pushed the country towards greater self-reliance in industries like automobile and energy. And Iran is actually, even though it's under sanctions, its GDP per capita is still higher than Bangladesh, I believe also India, Pakistan, entirety of Iran is the richest country in terms of GDP per capita in South Asia, if I'm not mistaken. And partly the reason for that is because of self-reliance, but also social cohesion, which is a part of behavioral economics that we will delve into another episode. So for governments under threat, autarky isn't just an economic policy. Autarky seems like a national insurance. If you produce your own food, if you produce your own fuel, or even the critical goods, no foreign sanction can starve your own people. So no embargo can bring your economy to its knees. Autarky, at least in theory, in my opinion, offers sovereignty on your own terms. The trade-off is clear: slower growth and higher costs, but in return, insulation from foreign leverage. And for some nations, especially those with histories of invasion or dependency, that cost might be worth paying for. So, with that being said, Mr. Shazib Karim, Mr. Hamdan Karim, Mr. Subid Nagala, would you guys also like to present your own versions of autarky when it comes to trade balance? Do you think some countries might actually benefit from it? Mr. Supreet Nagal, I see that your hand is raised.
Yes, I actually, after you played the devil's advocate, I believe it was very insightful, intriguing, and it sort of like got me thinking. So, I personally believe that the idea of how much a country should depend on others should be balanced, because I do believe, like you also mentioned, that true economic strength is not just from being completely autarkic or being completely open. It's important to strike a perfect balance. And I personally believe that countries must be self sufficient and must be completely independent when it comes to manufacturing necessities. This includes things like this will ensure that a nation stays stable, and this includes things like food, energy, healthcare, critical technology, and defense. I personally believe these five things must be done completely by a country, and a country must be self sufficient no matter what the comparative advantage might have been. And this is because these pillars will sustain sovereignty. Because if you can't feed your own people, if you can't produce your own medicine or power your own homes without relying entirely on someone else, you are extremely vulnerable. Like you also mentioned about Britain's case against Nazi Germany. England was very vulnerable to Nazis' blockade of food and vital resources, which almost collapsed the entire nation. And then we also saw this during 2019 when global shipping froze and countries suddenly realized how dependent they were on others for essential foods like rice or greens or even microchips and medical supplies. It was sort of a wake up call. But, and this is also important, being self sufficient doesn't mean closing yourself completely off. It's not about building walls around your economy. For non essential goods, things that fall more under the category of wants rather than needs, that's where comparative advantage should shine. Because if one country can produce cars more efficiently, another can focus on textiles, another on electronics. That specialization would drive innovation, lower costs, and raise living standards across the board. And the beauty of trade lies there in using the world's diversity of strengths to create mutual benefit. So, in my view, the ideal model isn't pure autarky or blind openness, it's strategic self sufficiency, especially when it comes to necessities and needs. Be independent in what matters most, and interdependent in what makes life better. It's about building resilience without rejecting cooperation. Or put simply, produce what you must, trade what you can. So, thank you. And Shazib Karim, I see your hand is raised. Could you please share your wonderful insights as well?
Yes, of course, Supreet. So, Supreet, I'd like to say that I 100% agree with you. And I think adding on to your insights, I'd say that, you know, like, I think it is a bit tricky and it is like a double edged sword, like you had kind of talked about, Supreet, because like many societies today are caught, they're seen to be like in like a tug of war between like authoritarian control and open freedoms. And I'd say that in terms of crisis, like for example, when there's wars, pandemics, or economic collapses, the governments often like swing towards authoritarian measures such as lockdowns, censorship, or emergency like lockdowns or stuff like this. But in terms of prosperity, when the economy is doing well, when the nation is doing well, that's when like citizens push for more openness, freedom to protest, and like to innovate and to demand for better governance. And I think like to like answer the big question on which approach is like creates long-term success, I think like it's tricky, like, and I'd 100% agree with what you had said, Supreet. And I think it's also worth remembering that this isn't just like a theory, it's about real lives. And in authoritarian states, the cost can be imprisonment for dissent, lack of personal freedom, or even violence. And in open societies, the challenge might look different: slower decision making, messy politics, or polarization. And I think to even like like I mentioned, this theory does impact like it does impact everyone into like in the society. So to give some case studies to look at, I think like Singapore is a good case study that we can look at, because under Lee Kuan Yew, Singapore balanced tight political control with economic openness, and they did have success because from a poor island in the 1960s, they became a global financial hub that it is known to be today. But the trade off here was that limited press freedom and restrictions on political opposition. And this was a model that was often cited as proof that, like, soft authoritarianism can deliver prosperity as well. So it's kind of relating back to what you had also mentioned, Supreet. Yeah,
Shazib,
your
I think
hand
we
was
should right for you back again. So we know today's topic is autarkic and autarkic versus uh, what's it called, openness. But you were also mentioning and talking about authoritarianism, and as a young economist, I don't really know how this authoritarianism really relates to autarkic behavior. So could you please explain it to me?
Yes, Supreet. What had you said? Authoritarianism, like how it fits. I think why I mentioned it. I think why I mentioned this because like authoritarianism, what it means is like it's a mode of rule where political power is concentrated in a leader of like small elite or of like it's like a mode of rule where political power is concentrated in a leader with or like a small elite group of people and like it sits at the opposite end of spectrum from openness because openness would talk about like transparency, your participation, and like upholding rights, whereas like authoritarianism is like when power is only concentrated with like only like a few elite group of people. You know what I mean, Supreet? That's why like, and it's like the direct opposite of openness, which is why I'd kind of brought this term up.
Makes complete sense. Thank you so much, Shazib.
Mr. Hamdan Karim, I see that your hand is raised. Would you like to also add something to the conversation?
Yes, thank you. Okay, so the truth is, uh, has been the truth is openness has been celebrated as the engine of modern growth. By integrating into the world economy, countries can specialize according to comparative advantage, import cheaper goods, and export what they produce most efficiently. Openness unlocks economies of scale, technology transfers, and knowledge spillovers that no country can replicate in isolation. It expands consumers and producer surplus, widens the welfare triangle, and in dynamic terms, accelerates long run growth. Integrations exposes countries to external shocks. The 2008 financial crisis sent ripple effects across open economies. COVID 19 brought global aviation and tourism to their knees, and today, tariff wars reveal how trade independence can quickly become geopolitical vulnerability. For small open economies, dependence on global market for food, energy, or security essentials raises the question on whether if it should always trump be resilience. Knowledge spills over knowledge spill over that borderline behaviors economies. Thank you. I see your hand is raised, Arib.
Thank you, Mr. Hamdan Karim. Yeah, I would agree with your succinct long run input, and I would also like acknowledge the knowledge spillover that you were saying, like it relates to sort of behavioral economics. And I would say like that's like borderline on like university level stuff. So like I would say for our conversations today, let's keep our topics to a bit more simple ended, but obviously show nuances. But I appreciate the level of depth that you're trying to go, Hamdan. So thank you very much for that. Yeah, Mr. Supreet Nagal, I see that your hand is raised. Would you like to add something?
Yes, I actually do. Because this current podcast episode is happening at quite an interesting time. Because we have Mr. Donald Trump masterfully using tariffs, which is a more of a autarkic mode of taxation. And we know that when Donald Trump returned to the White House, one of his most visible economic moves was to dramatically expand US tariffs, uh, both broadly and on China specifically, in the name of fair trade. And he wanted to protect domestic industry and reduce trade deficits. But we also know that tariffs can be good at times by protecting domestic industry, like I already mentioned. But tariffs could also be a double-edged sword, where they can also inflict immense costs onto the U.S. average consumer. So by mid 2025, the US had ramped up tariffs on a massive share of imports from the world. According to the Tax Foundation, the tariffs under Trump's policy affected around $2.2 trillion of US goods imports. And that's about 69% of US goods imports. And the administration's reciprocal tariff policy introduced baseline rates, a 10% tariff on all imports, and then higher rates on specific trading partners and sectors. And in the US China context, the tariff escalation has become especially dramatic. At one point, average US tariffs on Chinese goods peaked around 127.2% before being scaled back under negotiation. So, we know one of the most straightforward effects is that tariffs raise import costs. Those costs are often passed downstream to US consumers or firms. And many empirical studies show that import prices rise nearly dollar for dollar with tariff increases. So the lab actually at Yale University that I personally would like to go to has modeled that because of the 2025 tariff, US real GDP growth could be zero point 0.5 percentage points lower in 2025 and 2026. Mind you, this is the real GDP growth, so that's quite a big impact. And then Yale also estimates that by the end of 2025, unemployment could be zero point 0.3 percentage points higher. And all of this is horrible. So, my take, so I believe that tariffs are an inherently evil. In certain circumstances where even Donald Trump was justified, and I don't want to be political for sure because this is a very educational video, and I have no political views. No one here has political views because this is supposed to be a neutral podcast. But economically speaking, there were a few very good tariffs made by Trump where he was able to target and temporarily target good industries that were starting to fail in the US because of uh, the comparative advantage of other countries. And this meant that domestic industries started shrinking in some sectors, including, I believe, fish. And there were a few other sectors like corn. So these tariffs, with a clear purpose, were able to protect these critical industries. And I also believe that Trump's tariff is also a good opportunity to be a massive economic experiment because they have exposed fault lines in global trade and it has showed how fragile dependencies are, which is caused obviously by openness. And this has obviously forced many nations, including the US, to wrestle with the tension between sovereignty and integration. And then we also have India. India, even though it has been quite autarkic, it has also been, although it has been quite open, it has also been quite autarkic because one of the big reasons why the US and India weren't able to reach on a trade deal was because India wanted to protect the local milk industries, and importing milk and dairy from the US was way cheaper. However, this would obviously ruin critical industries in India. As a result, a trade deal was not met, even though the US had a comparative and also an absolute advantage. So, it's really interesting, and I hope this was insightful to you all. And Arib, I'm sorry for disturbing you. Could you please continue on ahead?
Oh no, no worries, Suprit. I thoroughly enjoyed your insights, and yeah, Dollar Dialogue is not a political podcast, but the points that you raised were clearly very promising. And now to move on to our next segment of the podcast. I think economy, the modern economics as we define it, is goes back to Adam Smith days, where I believe in the late 17th or 18th centuries, to the wealth of nations. However, economy as we know is actually existed since like ancient Mesopotamia, ancient Babylon, or even the Indus Valley civilization, which I believe is like disputed, but the world's oldest civilization, which is now in like India or in Pakistan, somewhere along the borders, quite not right yet. But the main point is that economics, the study of economics, goes way back, not just to Adam Smith. Adam Smith is the one who formally defined it as a field of study. But now, if you look at the historical examples, and this is another cost benefit analysis of trade history, India's tax independence is a good example. But other than that, I also want to talk about rewinding the clock to, let's say, self-sufficiency wasn't a choice, it was a survival. So before the rise of global trade routes, most kingdoms were autarkic, and this was by necessity. The Tokugawa shogunate in Japan, which I believe was from 1600s to early 1900s, famously closed its borders under the Sakoku policy, which maintained peace and internal stability for over 2 centuries. Similarly, China's Ming dynasty restricted maritime trade to guard against piracy and foreign influence, sustaining a vast internal market that rivaled any global empire. In modern times, autarky reemerged as a shield against dependency. Nazi Germany, for example, I was talking about this before, in the 1930s, pursued autarkic policies to prepare for war, stockpiling resources and aiming for economic independence through state control. And India's post-independence import substitution era sought to break away colonial legacy and foreign capital, while Soviet Union's command economy built a superpower insulated with with capitalist cycles. And for many of these nations, as I've mentioned before, autarky is not a state. Was not as wasn't about isolation. It was for its own stake and it was about dignity. I remember a quote from Winston Churchill, who during the wartime rationing stated, "We shall draw from the heart of suffering itself the means of aspiration and survival." So while economists point to inefficiencies and opportunity cost, history reminds us that autarky's appeal lies not in prosperity but in preservation. So in our debate, I think we should change our framework to what we define as economic prosperity, because prosperity in modern terms modern day comes from trade balance. Your country is in a trade surplus, so yeah, so it's not in a deficit. However, autarky's framework for success lies not in or prosperity lies in preservation, not only in terms of growth as we conventionally might think. And recently as well, I was reading an article. I think it was in JSTOR. And in the ancient Sparta, for example, isolation was a badge of honor. Foreign luxuries were banned, coinage were made deliberately heavy to discourage trade, and the focus stayed on self-reliance and military discipline. And it just goes on to show that the autarky, even to feudal manners, it was a way of life in those old days. And it was not more about ideology but more about sovereignty. So the points that Chazib raised regarding authoritarianism, it is related to it, as economics and politics often intersects. But I would say autarky, as we know, intersects more with governance and control than openness, as openness is more of a non-interventionist market policy. Mr. Shazib Karim, I see that your hand is raised. Would you like to chime in?
Yeah, yeah. First of all, I'd like to say that I 100% agree with your insights, and due to that, I also had like a question that came up to me. So, to any of you guys, like, do you think that with the rising polarization in democracies that we see in today's day and age, do you think that openness can survive in this age of misinformation?
Could you please define polarization and which countries or regions specifically?
I mean, democracies, polarization. What I mean by that is like the division into like two different groups, like two contrasting groups, like division in like two distinct ideologies. You can say like our world, like how our day and age is having like more different ideologies and more separations in some way. You can say that's what I meant. And like in some democracies like um mm, I mean it's up to you about which democracy you want to talk about. I don't really have a specific one in mind.
Hamdan,
I
I
see
see
Mr.
your hand is
Hamdan's.
raised. Yes.
Oh, sorry, Mr. Subir Nagal. I see that Mr. Hamdan Karim, your hand is raised. Do you have any insights, given your adept historical knowledge when it comes to this field, as you were AISD's voted most brilliant student in historical studies?
Yeah, thank you so much. Uh, yeah, so uh, I'm sorry, I'm having some technical difficulties.
Apologies, viewers. It seems like Mr. Karim is currently facing technical difficulties. Bangladesh is currently under electrical shutdown under some parts of the city due to import restrictions. So we apologize for that. I see Mr. Shazib Karim. Oh no, apologies, Mr. Supreet Nagala. Your hand is raised. Would you like to chime in?
I would love to, but unfortunately, the electrical shutdown has got me as well. So, Arib, I think you're the one to answer this.
Absolutely, yes. I apologize, viewers, for the electrical shutdown. It is a rising issue in Bangladesh, and our government is trying to fix it. But to move on to our topic, and to answer Shazib's question, the modern face of openness, can democracy survive globalization? If I'm not mistaken, what Shazib was asking. And I would say autarky, as I mentioned before, once meant survival, walls, self-reliance, and control. But in today's democracy, the question isn't whether to trade; it's whether openness can survive the very societies that built it. For much of the 20th century, open trade and liberalization, or liberal democracy as we know it, grew together. Off the top of my head, I can think of the Bretton Woods system, the creation of IMF, World Trade Organization, and the rise of European Union, all reflected a belief that economic interdependence could secure peace. Nations that traded together, the thinking went, wouldn't go to war together, and for decades it worked. Europe rebuilt, Asia industrialized, and billions rose out of poverty. In in DP year one, or even in AP macro, I believe we learn about comparative advantage, and the idea behind it is pretty simple. Not all nations can produce to their maximum point, and I think this relates to the production possibilities frontier. And the only way to increase the production possibilities frontier is either to increase your labor specialization in labor, or specialization in technology. And countries often have to make that choice. So what's easier is to just trade, and through basic math we can find out that when you trade with other countries, your production possibility frontier essentially expands. And the reason for that is because other countries specialize in a certain goods and you specialize in a certain goods. So through that interdependence and exchange, you're essentially getting the better of both goods essentially. However, it isn't as simple as that. And I think what Shazam asking is a really important point to address, because fast forward to today, the same openness that once symbolized progress now fuels anxiety. Democracies are discovering that global markets can outvote their citizens. Factories move abroad faster than policies can adapt. Populist movements from US to Italy to even India tap into fear that globalization benefits the elite while hollowing out the middle class. For example, if you look at modern day, the Brexit referendum, Supreet was talking about America's tariff wars, or even if you look at France's Yellow Vest protests, all reflect the same tension. Democracy maintains consent when markets move at the speed of algorithms, and that's a question that is very difficult to address. And at the same time, openness remains democracy's greatest strength. South Korea, Taiwan, and Germany prove that integrating globally can coexist with vibrant institutions and welfare system. When paired with strong governance, openness is actually really good as it creates innovative ecosystems. But the challenge isn't globalization itself. I think it's managing its distributional consequences. And the paradox is that democracies need openness to thrive, yet openness can undermine the very trust democracy depends on. Trade raises GDP, inequality erodes legitimacy. Therefore, what I see is that the system strains when citizenship feels more exposed to global markets and protected by their governance. So perhaps the question isn't whether openness can survive in democracy; it's whether democracies can evolve fast enough to make openness sort of fair again. So, Mr. Shazib Karim, I see that your hand is raised. Would you like to chime in?
Yeah, Arib. Like first of all, I'm like, wow, I'm in awe, Ari. What an answer, bro. That was like very insightful. And I think like to add on, I think you like covered it very well. But I think adding on, like to answer my own question, I think like like polarization and like misinformation is also a crucial factor. And these things, they like test the very foundation of openness, because they exploit its strengths like free speech and open debate and turn them into vulnerabilities. Because on one hand, openness means that people can share ideas freely and hold leaders accountable, and challenge the authority. But when misinformation spreads unchecked, it can fracture societies into echo chambers where people no longer trust the same facts. And polarization then makes compromising almost impossible, slowing down decision making and eroding faith in the democratic institutions. But I think that openness, of course, it can survive with that, like, even though like there are like a lot of spread of misinformation through media especially as well, openness still can survive, but it requires like constant investment, because as I mentioned, media is crucial. And I think there should be investment in media literacy, in stronger institutions, and rebuilding trust.
Shazib, that deserves an applause, man. Thank you. And you too, Arif. And Hamdan, of course, your insights have been so amazing, and I just can't wait for your insights on this topic as well. So go ahead, I'm Hamdan Karim.
Yes, thank you very much. That was a very amazing answer.
Apologies, viewers. It seems like Hamdan Karim is facing internet difficulties, but Mr. Suprit Nagal, was it a question that you were asking Mr. Hamdan Karim?
Not really. I just wanted his beautiful insights on this topic as well.
Okay. Yeah, understood. Mr. Hamdan Karim, can you hear us?
Yes, sorry. Can Is it better now? Can you
Yeah,
hear
it's
me?
better now. Yeah, yeah. You can go ahead. Yeah.
Okay, okay. Thank you, thank you. So, uh, I'm gonna start by saying that I want to ask, if openness creates prosperity but also fuels inequality and political backlash, should democracy inherently show globalization to protect social stability, or would that be like cutting off oxygen to save a patient from hyperventilating? So I think it's a question as uncomfortable as it is urgent. For decades, open trade and democracy were seen as twin forces of progress. That post-war order, built through institutions like the IMF, World Bank, and later the WTO, rested on a simple faith that economic interdependence would make nations richer and, by extension, freer. The logic was seductive. Countries that trade together won't fight each other, and for half a century that seemed true. Western European integrations made old rival allies. East Asia's export-driven boom lifted hundreds of millions out of poverty. But fast forward to today, and openness feels like a promise and more like a pressure point. Globalization gains have been uneven. While stock markets surged and global GDP tripled between 1990 and 2020, manufacturing towns from Ohio to northern England saw factories close, wages stagnate, and identities erode. Automatic and outsourcing hollowed out the middle class, even as consumers enjoyed cheaper goods. The result? Populist politics trumps America's first Brexit, take better control, India's at Atmanirbhar Bharat, self-reliant India, all rooted in a sense that global openness had outpaced democratic consent. Still retreating into economic nationalism carries its own risks. When Britain left the EU, it regained sovereignty, but also frictionless access to a market of 450 million consumers. Supply chains fractured, investment fell, and inflation soared. Similarly, when the US imposed steel and aluminum tariffs in 2018 to protect jobs, the policy backfired, raising costs for American manufacturers while saving fewer than 10,000 positions. Economically, the math of protectionism rarely adds up. Politically, it can win votes in the short run but erode competitiveness in the long run. This doesn't mean democracies must surrender to unregulated globalization. Far from it. The key lies in intelligent openness, staying connected to global markets while protecting citizens from the turbulence they bring. Germany's dual apprenticeship system, for instance, retrains workers displaced by trade shocks into advanced manufacturing roles. South Korea pairs openness with state led innovation, ensuring its tech sector competes globally while maintaining domestic employment. The US chips and Science Act and EU Green Deal represents similar efforts to reclaim strategic industries, semiconductors, renewable energy without abandoning trade entirely. There's also a moral dimension here. Democracies can't credibly champion openness abroad if they don't ensure fairness at home. When globalization creates billionaires faster than it builds hospitals, the political fabric frays. Inequality isn't just an economic variable, it's a democratic vulnerability. As citizens lose faith that their voices matter more than market forces, polarization rises, and demagogus fills the void. So, should democracy slow globalization? Maybe not, but they must reshape it. Openness must revolve from a race to the bottom, where capital chases cheap labor, to a race to resilience, where innovation, sustainability, and equity define competitiveness. That means trade deals with labor standards, digital taxation for multinationals, and green transitions that create jobs rather than fear. Globalization isn't dying, it's decentralizing. Supplying chains are moving closer to home. Digital trade is replacing container ships and data, not oil. Is becoming the most traded commodity.
Hamdan, I have a
Uh,
that was
yes,
such an amazing response, but I also have a very interesting question to you. So, Hamdan, do you think we've entered a new era where economic efficiency is completely replacing economic security as the global priority? And if so, are we just watching a transformation into something more fragmented and strategic? Because I believe, at least due to globalization, economic security, especially with necessities, are being replaced with economic efficiency. So, what are your thoughts on this?
thank you so much, Supreet. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? Hello?
No, unfortunately, the internet doesn't seem to be working. Um, 1 second, let me try fixing my internet. Hamdan, do you hear me by any chance? Hello, Hamdan. Hamdan,
Hello, yeah, I slightly hear you.
1 second, let me try helping you.
Apologies, viewers. It seems like Mr. Supri Nagala was facing difficulty. So, Mr. Hamdan Karim, I believe your internet is fine now. Would you like to answer Mr. Supri Nagala's question, perhaps?
Yeah, sorry, his internet cut out. If you could repeat his question, Arid.
Yeah,
Yes,
for
Mr. Supri
sure.
Nagala.
Okay, so my question was, do you believe that economic efficiency is completely replacing economic security? Because, like necessities, they aren't being countries aren't trying to be self-sufficient on necessities anymore. They're focusing on globalization, and this is making efficiency uh, take over economic security. And I believe this is a big problem as well. So, Hamdan, what do you personally believe on this?
Yeah, that's a really sharp question. Here's how I'd look at it. I think economic efficiency often gets prioritized over economic security, but it hasn't fully replaced it. Global trade, just-in-time supply chains, and financial liberalization and designed to cut costs and maximize growth. That makes economies leaner but also more fragile. The 2008 crisis, COVID-19 disruptions, and the Ukraine war all exposed how quickly efficiency driven systems break down when shock hits. At the same time, governments are realizing security matters too. Many are now stockpiling essentials, reshoring industries, and investing in food and energy independence. The EU's Strategic Autonomy Plan, the US CHIPS Act, and India's push for self reliance all shows a shift back towards resilience. So efficiency hasn't replaced security, but has overshadowed it for decades. The current trend seems to be moving towards a balance. Countries still want efficiency, but they are increasingly willing to sacrifice a bit of it for stability and protection against global risks.
Hamdan, I just wanted to ask you if you knew about any specific numbers or any specific uh, things on how economic efficiency is like being taken over by economic security.
Thank you very much, Preet. So that was really thank you for that question. So this really this I actually looked into this for one of my papers. So this reminds me that global spending patterns suggest that governments are increasingly prioritizing security over pure economic efficiency. In 2024, worldwide military expenditure reached US $2.7 trillion, or 2.5% of global GDP, the highest share in decades. Military budgets now consume about 7% of total government spending, which limits room for investments in infrastructure, education, or innovation that traditionally drives efficiency. In the EU, defense outlays rose to 1.3% of GDP, while the US more than doubled its federal cybersecurity and infrastructure security budget between 2018 and 2024. This rapid growth contrasts with slower increase in areas like R&D or public infrastructure, signaling a reallocation of resources. While these moves reflect a need for resilience in a world of geopolitical conflict, supply chain fragility, and cyber threats, they also show that the government are deliberately sacrificing some efficiency gains in favor of stability and protection. Do those numbers satisfy you, Supreet?
They definitely do, man. I'm a numbers guy, and thank you so much, man. So, I also have a question for you. Another question. If the 20th century was defined by oil and the 21st century by data, what do you think will be the next key driver of economic dominance? And will openness or self reliance determine who wins that race?
I'm so very sorry. Was that question directed to me or Mr. Arib?
Mostly to the guest speaker, of course, because I remember reading two papers that you had actually made on this topic. So obviously, you are very well versed.
Oh yes, yes. I'm so very sorry, but you cut out while you were saying the question.
Mr.
Um,
Shuprit Naval, I believe your internet cut out.
Hi, do you remember the question?
Yes, I believe the
Oh yes,
question
yes.
Mr.
I remember.
Shuprit
Oh
Navala was
gosh, I'm
asking,
sorry.
Hamdan, was if the 20th century was defined by oil and the 21st century by data, what do you think will be the next key driver of economic dominance, and will openness or self reliance determine who wins that race? And Mr. Hamdan Karim, I believe that you unofficially published a few research papers on this. Would you like to
Oh
contribute
yes, yes.
statistics?
I had
Yes.
published a research paper on this, and this is what I thought. If the 20th century was defined by oil and the 21st century by data, the next driver of economic dominance may well be controlled over critical technologies and resources that enable sustainability and security, from artificial intelligence and quantum computing to rare earth minerals and green energy. Unlike oil, which was concentrated in a handful of regions or data, which scaled through global networks, these new drivers combine both physical scarcity and technological know how. The decisive question is whether openness or self reliance will determine who leads. Openness allows rapid diffusion of innovations, global collaboration, and access to supply chains that no country can replicate alone. Yet, self reliance provides resilience, the ability to secure energy, food, and technology inputs without being hostage to foreign shocks or political leverage. The race will not be won by efficiency alone, but by those who can strike a balance between tapping global flows of knowledge and insulation themselves from the vulnerabilities that come with independence. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Hamdan Karim. And I would, and just to add on a little bit more to that, I would also say why this triad that we're asking. I would say the reason for that is because computer demand is also exploding. Data centers use around 1.5% of global electricity in 2024 and are on track to double that by 2030. And this is propelled by AI. So that implies that power demand rising, and with over 15% per year for data centers, over 4x faster than total electricity growth demand. Additionally, if you look at the energy investment sector, it is also tilting to electrons. In 2025, investment in electricity sector hit 1.5 trillion, which is 50% more than spending to bring oil and gas to the market. So cheap, clean, 24/7 power becomes a compute superpower. And also, if you look at choke points are brutal. TSMC, for example, which is the Taiwanese chip company, it controls 64% of global foundry output and effectively all leading edge logic, while ASML is the only supplier of EUV tools. One island, one company, and one tool chain, which is a massive leverage. And materials are also geopolitical. China produced around 70% of rare earths in 2024 and dominates processing. Battery minerals, lithium, nickel, graphite must be at least 4x by or 4 times by 2030 in net zero paths. Another country where without mineral access or friends is stuck on the on ramp. And water is also a silent constraint. Around 10% of people live under high critical water access. Agriculture already takes up 70%, 72% of withdrawals, if I'm not mistaken. Also, if you look at the leading edge fabs and hyperscale data centers are also very thirsty. Regions with stressed basins are also facing hard trade-offs. So who wins, openness or self-reliance? I would say neither extreme. The winners will practice strategic openness, deeply open in standards, data, talent, and capital, but self-reliant is in critical nodes like power, fabs, lithography, access, and minerals. Think allianced resilience. Democracies that combine open markets with targeted industrial policy will outperform closed autarkies and laissez-faire peers. So, in my opinion, there should not be any open extreme openness or autarky. I believe that countries will find success when they sort of leverage both autarky for sectors that are very important or necessity, and openness for sectors that are not as necessity but but are comparatively advantaging them. So is that a conclusion that you guys would agree, Mr. Suprit Nagala, Mr. Hamdan Karim, or Mr. Shazak Karim?
Ari, is everything okay? I can't hear you. Is everything okay?
uh yeah, your internet is a bit muffly, Mr. Suprit Nagala. Can you hear me now?
Oh, yes. Thank you so much, man. I completely agree with you on your beautiful conclusion. You summarized it just the way I would have wanted it as well. So thank you so much. Hamdan, what do you believe?
Yes, very well said by Arib. Thank you so much. And I think that was a perfect conclusion. And yes, thank you very much for having me for the second time. Third time's the charm.
For sure, Hamdan, third time is sure the charm. Because did you know we brought you back on the episode because we had over 30 to 40 people all in the comments just writing your name. They wanted you back, and thank you for accepting such such an such and thank you for providing us this opportunity to speak with you. And I'm sure the viewers will be enthralled by all of this. So thank you, man.
Yes, of course. And next time you guys want me in this podcast, just speak with my associate. I'll leave her email in the comments below.
Sounds like a good plan, man. Thanks. Please do share the email as soon as you can.
Thank you, Mr. Subhi Thagal and Mr. Hamdan Karim for those insightful responses. And yeah, Mr. Hamdan Karim, it was a pleasure having you on our podcast today. And obviously, third time's a charm. Dollar Dialogue has yet to have a guest speaker to arrive 3 times before. You're one of the few. You and Mr. Rishan Ali, who also is Rishan is more on the historical side, but Hamdan, you're very intellectual when it comes to economics and financial inclusion, as well as little bit of geopolitical affairs. So thank you so much for coming today, Mr. Hamdan. Is there any final words that you would like to say to the Dollar Dialogue listeners on YouTube, Spotify, or even on iHeart Radio or Amazon Podcast? Any final words that you would like to say before we depart for today?
No, thank you. I believe that will be all for today.
Yeah, man. Could we please share your Instagram with the audience? They just love you, man. You'll get a lot of people following you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you very much for giving me the chance to have my name out there. So my Instagram is BMCA, BMCA Dhaka. So if you guys could all just follow me, thank you.
Sounds like a good
Uh,
plan, and thank you for
thank,
the
thank you.
plug-in.
Thank you everyone for today's episode, and thank you viewers to for listening to episode 56, which was about autarky versus openness, a cost benefit analysis of trade policy with our guest speaker Hamdan Karim. And thank you for watching today's video, and stay tuned for another episode next week with another very interesting guest speakers. Thank you, and that is all for today. Goodbye.